Hi, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. My challenge is I have to follow some wonderful music, and I have to begin with an apology, which is I know going to be a huge disappointment to many of you, but unfortunately, I have absolutely no PowerPoint slides to share with you. And I realize that would be a huge disappointment, and I apologize. What I want to do is, at a very high level, focus on some of the business implications of all these exponential technologies. Just about this point in time in these kinds of gatherings, there's a sense of being overwhelmed by the technology and a set of questions around, okay, this is amazing, now what do I do? And so I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the things, not all of the things because I don't have enough time, but some of the things that I think are going to be important for businesses. And the good news is I also have a fireside chat this evening, which I'm going to reserve for more discussion around the way I frame the question is, where's the money in all of this? So to start, I just want to pull back a bit because we've talked about the technology, we've talked about exponential manufacturing. I think there's a danger of getting siloed in this exponential world. When we talk about exponential manufacturing, it implies there are some boundaries there that are important and relevant. And at one level, there are. But at another level, one of the challenges and opportunities of this exponential world is all those boundaries that we're so familiar with are blurring. And we need to think beyond the boundaries, go beyond the edge, if you will. And in that context, it was mentioned that we've been doing work at the Center for the Edge, my research center, on what we call the big shift, which is a view that, of how the business world on a global basis is transforming over a period of decades. Our belief is this big shift actually isn't out in the future. It's not even today. It's been going on for at least 50 years, very early stages, but still, we have a record of a big shift already underway. And I think it's important to put that into context. Our view is the big shift is going to be profoundly disruptive to all businesses. All businesses will have to change in some pretty significant ways, not just manufacturing. One of those ways is we captured it around the notion of push to pull. Traditional businesses, traditional companies that have been built up and very successful to date have been built around a model of push as resource mobilization. The key in push models is you develop a forecast or prediction of demand, and then you push all the relevant people and resources into the right place at the right time to meet that demand. Hugely efficient way of organizing and mobilizing resources, if those forecasts and predictions are accurate. In an increasingly uncertain world, in an increasingly exponential world, our belief is the companies that will succeed in the future are those that master scalable pull platforms. And when we talk about scalable pull, I know many of you in manufacturing have talked about pull-based inventory systems, lean manufacturing. Typically, those approaches have worked if you have a limited number of partners or participants, 5 to 10 perhaps. When we talk about scalable pull platforms, we're talking about platforms that involve tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and in an increasing number of cases, millions of participants that can be drawn out, pulled out, when needed and where needed, as needed. Very different approach to mobilizing and organizing resources. Requires significant changes in all our business practices. And I would say, based on our research, the leading edge companies in terms of scalable pull platforms are not here in the United States, not in Western Europe. They're actually in China and India. And we've looked at a number of companies that are doing some very interesting things around scalable pull platforms in industries as diverse as apparel, motorcycles, agricultural products, financial services. Our belief is this is a model that applies across industries, not specific to an individual industry. And just as a quick example of a scalable pull platform, the company was mentioned earlier in one of the previous presentations. It's a Chinese company called Fung. They're in the clothing apparel industry. Their customers are the brand apparel designers that we all know and love, Calvin Klein and Taylor. They organize all the activities required from sourcing of raw materials through all the stages of production, all the logistics, to deliver to whatever retail distribution center you specify anywhere in the world. The really interesting thing about Li and Fung is they do none of that themselves. They operate through a global ecosystem, network, of over 15,000 business partners who do all that activity. Li and Fung is the orchestrator of all that activity, but they don't do the activity. They have created a scalable, global pull platform involving 15,000 partners at a time when Western companies are steadily shrinking the number of partners in their global supply chains in the name of efficiency. Li and Fung is adding more partners every day. They're not stopping at 15,000, they're expanding. So I think there are some very interesting companies that give us some early indicators of what scalable pull platforms might look like and what's required to actually make them work on a global scale. So we're in the early stages of a big shift that is going to be profoundly disruptive. I think one of the key questions that we would put on the table is, so where should I position myself in this big shift, in this new global business landscape? In that context, there's a debate that's been going on in Silicon Valley for decades, and we decided to take on the debate. The debate has two sides that are very passionate about their beliefs. There's one side of the debate which argues that the impact of all this digital technology is to fragment everything. We're all going to become free agents, independent contractors, we'll loosely affiliate when we need to around specific projects. But basically, companies are dinosaurs. We're going to fragment down to the individual. The gig economy to the max. That's one side. There's another side with equal passion and conviction that argues actually, because of network effects, digital technology is creating a winner-take-all economy, where there will be a very few global entities, highly concentrated, that will capture the vast bulk of the economic wealth, and everybody else is going to be marginalized. That's an interesting debate. You couldn't have two more extreme positions. Which one is right? Well, as I said, we decided to take this on, and perhaps in classic consulting fashion, we came up with the answer that both are right. It just depends on which part of the economy you're talking about. Our belief, based on the work we've done, and there's a lot more research that we can share with you if you're interested in this topic, our belief is there will be fragmentation in certain parts of the economy, and there will be concentration and consolidation in other parts of the economy. If we're right about that, if you are a large company today, or have aspirations to be a very large company, you sure would like to be positioned in the parts of the business landscape that are going to concentrate and consolidate. Because if you're in the fragmenting part of the landscape, good luck. Life is going to get harder and harder for you as a large company. So, at a very high level, the answer we came to was fragmentation is going to occur largely in what we would call product innovation and commercialization businesses. Coming up with creative new products, getting them into market quickly, and accelerating the adoption of those products. Variety of forces that we see driving this. One force is the notion that the means of production are becoming more and more accessible, in part because of these technologies we've been talking about. It used to be that if you were going to create a music record, you needed to go into an extraordinarily expensive studio to produce that record. Now you can do it in your garage with equipment that's affordable by virtually anyone. So the means of production are becoming more accessible, affordable, and if they're not affordable, they're available increasingly on a rental basis. I don't need to have a chip fab facility. I can rent capacity in somebody else's fab facility if I've got an interesting chip design. So the means of production are becoming more accessible and affordable to more and more people with creative new product ideas. And on the other side, you have platforms that are emerging, everything from funding platforms to talent platforms to market platforms that can help provide me as a small business with access to whatever I need to create and commercialize that product that I've come up with, that product idea I've come up with. Now, we've started to see this play out in the digital world. Digital media has gone through this process. As I said, this big shift is already underway. It's just affecting different parts of the economy at different times. But in digital media, everything from music to video to software, we're increasingly seeing dramatic fragmentation of product businesses because more and more people can participate at much smaller scale. Our belief is that's going to spread out to the services industries and to physical product industries as a result of some of the technologies that we've looked at. Now, to be clear, I would not make the case that fragmentation is going to occur to all products. Our belief is there are certain variables that you would look to assess the vulnerability to fragmentation. Part of it has to do with regulation. Part of it has to do with product complexity, product size and weight, and issues around just functionality of the product that can be digitized. How much of the product today that's physical can be digitized and delivered in digital form. So there are a lot of variables at work, but our belief is there will be more and more fragmentation in the product business in the broader economy. The concentration and consolidation will occur in a different part of the economy. In several areas, one we call infrastructure services, scale-intensive services to support these fragmented players. Again, I mentioned contract manufacturing, contract call centers, logistics firms. We're already seeing significant concentration and consolidation in those infrastructure service businesses. Data center operations would be another example. There's a second part of the economy that we believe will concentrate and consolidate, and it has to do with aggregation platforms. Aggregating resources that are of value to a lot of participants and making those more readily available to those participants. That's just emerging, but you're starting to see that in a variety of arenas. And then a third area of concentration and consolidation, which I will acknowledge is the most speculative, but we think actually one of the most interesting ones, which is what we call the customer relationship business. And what we mean by that is a business that can become your trusted advisor, that will get to know you as an individual, not as part of a segment, not as part of a mass market, but as an individual, will get to know you better than anyone else. And based on that knowledge, will be proactive in suggesting things to you. They won't wait just for you to ask for something. They'll reach out and say, by the way, you haven't asked for this, but based on your context, your aspirations, this could be really valuable to you. That's a very different kind of business from the ones we have today. I know most of our companies would say they're customer-centric. They're customer-centric as long as they can push more of their products to the customer. This notion of getting on the customer's side, by the way, if you're on the customer's side and you're a trusted customer advisor, you're going to recommend competitors' products if those are the best products for that particular customer at that point in time. How many of you do that? But our belief is that business has the potential to go mass market and has the potential, because of economies of scope, to become highly concentrated and consolidated. The more I know about you as an individual customer, the more helpful I can be to you, rather than just a narrow slice of who you are. And the more other customers I'm serving, the more helpful I can be to you as an individual customer, because I can start to see patterns of needs and people being served with those needs, and you haven't asked for it. So, 3 areas of the economy that we believe will concentrate and consolidate, having to do, again, with infrastructure services, platform businesses, and customer relationship businesses. If you're a large company, or have aspirations to be a large company, we would suggest those are the parts of the economy you ought to be focused on to really ensure continued growth and success. And by the way, one of the interesting things about this analysis is these 2 trends that we see, fragmentation and concentration, are not just proceeding in parallel, they are reinforcing and amplifying each other. You wouldn't have the degree of fragmentation if there weren't these concentrated and consolidated businesses and services to support those fragmented businesses. And those fragmented businesses couldn't stay fragmented if they didn't have those concentrated services to rely on. And it opens up a whole new possibility for growth, which I won't go into here, but we can talk about at the fireside chat, which is something that we call leveraged growth, which is changing the whole discussion around growth. Today, if I sit in a boardroom around discussions of growth strategy, it falls into 2 choices: make or buy. Those are the 2 paths to growth. The only question is, how much of each do we want to do? We would suggest there's a 3rd path to growth that's not on the agenda but needs to be, which is mobilizing third-party resources in ways that add value to your market and allow you to capture an increasing amount of that value without buying or owning or developing internally the capability. So, strategies of position are becoming more and more central in this big shift world. Knowing where you want to be is going to be a key determinant of success. And by the way, there is urgency about that choice. And by the way, it's a choice about a position in the future, not your position today, but where do you want to be down the road? There's urgency about that choice because all those businesses that I talked about that are concentrating and consolidating, there are powerful network effects at work in all of those businesses. So you can't be a fast follower in those business areas. You got to move quickly and aggressively if you're serious about targeting those positions in the business landscape. So there is urgency to that choice. In that context, I want to introduce another approach that we think is going to become more and more central. It's a different approach to strategy. We're all familiar with the 5-year plan. There is another approach to strategy that successful Silicon Valley companies have pursued that we think has enormous power in an exponential world. It's what's known as a zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy. And that approach to strategy focuses on 2 time horizons in parallel. One time horizon is 10 to 20 years. And in that time horizon, 2 questions on the table. 10 to 20 years from now, what is our market or industry going to look like? And given that, what kind of company do we need to be 10 to 20 years from now in order to be successful? 2 simple questions. On the other side, it zooms in to a very different time frame, which is 6 to 12 months. And in that time frame, the questions on the table are, in the next 6 to 12 months, what are the 2 or 3 business initiatives, no more, 2 or 3 business initiatives that could have the greatest impact in accelerating our movement towards that longer-term destination? Do we have a critical mass of resource against those 2 or 3 initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? And how would we measure success? At the end of 6 months or 12 months, how would we decide whether we succeeded in what we were trying to do? What are the metrics? Very powerful set of questions around 2 very different time horizons. In this approach, by the way, the 1 to 5 year time horizon, that 5-year plan, is virtually irrelevant. They spend almost no time on 1 to 5 years. It's 10 to 20 years or 6 to 12 months. That's where all the action is. And it's very powerful for a number of reasons. One of them is, I think many of you, maybe if not all of you, have been through some kind of scenario planning exercise. You gather a group of people, sit in a room, and you imagine what the future could look like 10 to 20 years from now, or maybe even longer. Really interesting discussion. In the interest of coming to closure, you all converge around agreement on what a future might be. And then you go back to your day jobs. Nothing changes. It was an interesting exercise. The zoom out, zoom in approach forces the question of, if that is the future, what are the 2 or 3 things in the very short term that we need to be doing to accelerate movement? It takes it from theory to practice, to action. What are the action implications? It also avoids the risk that I think a lot of large companies have in a world of increasing uncertainty. There's a temptation to fall into a reactive strategy where you just basically sense and respond to whatever's going on. And the result is you spread your resources way too thinly across too many things. There's no sense of prioritization as to what's really important. So a very powerful approach to strategy that we think can be very helpful, both in deciding those strategies of position, where do I want to be 10 to 20 years from now relative to fragmentation and concentration, and what do I need to be doing today to accelerate my movement there. The final observation I'll make is that our belief, given the big shift and the exponential forces that are at work here, is that all of us, all of our companies, are going to face the challenge of fundamental transformation. This isn't just incremental innovation or modifications on the edge. It is fundamental transformation of a large company. In that context, I've been involved in large-scale transformation efforts now for over 30 years. I have only one lesson to share with you in all of that experience. And that lesson is that if you believe that large-scale transformation is a rational process, if you believe that it's about gathering the right data, doing the right analytics, putting it into the right charts, presenting it to the right people, you've already lost. My humble opinion, we can debate and discuss at the fireside chat, but my experience is it is not a rational process at all. It is fundamentally a political process. And it really only has 3 objectives. Objective number 1, identify and neutralize, by all means necessary, the enemies of change. That is not as easy as it sounds, because I will tell you again from my experience, and maybe you've had different experiences, but from my experience, I have never been in a senior leadership meeting of a company where an executive has stood up and announced, I am an enemy of change. Hasn't happened. What happens is they sit around the table, look at the charts, smile, nod at each other, say, yes, we need to change, and then they go back into the privacy of their offices to conspire to figure out how to undermine the process of change. So identifying the enemies of change is non-trivial. Second objective, identify and strengthen, by all means possible, the champions of change. And then there's a third objective, and here I take great inspiration from a book that I hope many of you have read. I would certainly encourage you to read it if you haven't. It's called The Art of War. One of the key messages in The Art of War is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. And what happens if you develop the conviction that we need to change, change is urgent and necessary, your immediate temptation is to confront the enemies of change. Do battle, get it over with, win the battle and move on. My advice is resist that temptation. In fact, delay for as long as humanly possible any confrontation between the enemies of change and the champions of change, until the champions have become so strong and the enemies so weak that a battle isn't even necessary. It's a foregone conclusion as to who's going to win. That's very hard to do in practice, but at least from my experience, that's absolutely important. In that context, my belief is the top-down, what I call the top-down Big Bang approaches to change are doomed to failure. An executive gets up, announces that we need to change everything. We're a large company, it's going to cost a lot of money. We're a large company, it's going to take a long time. You can't turn around a battleship overnight. But at the end of all that, wonderful things are going to happen. What that person has just done is put on their back a bullseye and invited all the antibodies and the immune system of the organization to mobilize to attack. It's going to cost a lot of money. Where's that money coming from? It's going to take a long time. I got quarterly numbers to meet. I need those resources for that. So, is there an alternative? I only have 3 minutes to give you a hint of it, but again, hopefully this evening can give you a little more exposure to it. It's something that we call scaling edges. It's an approach that says rather than trying to do top-down, big bang approach to change, or the alternative approach that's become more popular now is skunkworks. You create some skunkworks out on the edge, and you build it up a little bit, get to some critical mass, and then you shove that skunkworks back into the core and use it as a catalyst for change. Our experience is those efforts, the immune system is very good at identifying these foreign bodies and mobilizing to attack as they come back in. The alternative approach of scaling edges is no, start on an edge, but identify an edge to the company that, because of these exponential forces that are at work and the big shift that we've been talking about, has the potential to scale to the point where it could actually become the new core of your business. Not just a diversification, a little product adjunct or a new business initiative. No, actually could become the core of your business in terms of profits and revenues generated. And then focus on scaling that edge, and over time, pulling more and more of the people and resources from the core out to the edge, to the point where it becomes the new core. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge there aren't a lot of great examples of scaling edges fully played out. There's one illustration that I'll just share with you because I already mentioned the company. It's called Fung, that Chinese company. Fung is actually a very old company. They started in Hong Kong over 100 years ago. Most of their life, until the 1970s, Fung was a classic broker business. They connected an apparel designer in the West with a manufacturing plant in China. They took a commission, did the deal, and moved on to the next deal. Two brothers took over the company in the mid-1970s, and they were under increasing margin pressure on those commissions, and they said, we got to change. This is not sustainable. And they engaged, actually, they didn't describe it at the time, it was intuitive, but they engaged in a zoom out, zoom in kind of approach, and they zoomed out and said the apparel industry is becoming more complex on a global scale, and apparel designers need somebody who can be their trusted advisor, who can basically help them to navigate through an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world out there. And again, rather than going in and announcing to the organization, we're changing everything, they created a small business unit on the side. It was the Calvin Klein business unit. It had 3 people in it. And the assignment for those 3 people was go out to the Calvin Klein organization and basically live with them, get to know them better than they know themselves, and become more and more helpful to them in terms of connecting to relevant resources around the world. Long story short, that business unit scaled very rapidly. They tapped into an unmet need that the Calvin Klein organization had, and they scaled that very rapidly. And then they started adding other business units for other apparel designers. And over time, that became the core of their business. And at the end of the day, the few deal makers that were left, the ones who were collecting those commissions for the broker deals, basically ended up leaving because they weren't part of this new business. They couldn't understand, why would I spend time developing deep relationships, trust-based relationships? I'm a deal guy. So interesting transition, fundamental transformation of the company, but they scaled an edge rather than going in to try to transform the core. So I've just managed to skim over the surface. I think part of this is understanding the broader context of the big shift, and then figuring out the fragmentation concentration issues, because position matters. Where you are in this big shift in terms of the global landscape increasingly matters. And it's very helpful in terms of positioning to take this zoom out, zoom in approach to figure out where you need to be and what you need to be doing today to get there. And then, as you face the transformation challenge, think about scaling edges as an alternative approach to get transformation in the business. And I'll just say as one last comment that my belief is that if we get this right, I like to say I'm from Silicon Valley and I'm a genetic optimist. I believe we are, one way of describing the big shift is we are moving from a set of business models that basically are characterized by diminishing returns. I started my career at Boston Consulting Group, BCG, many years ago. And at the time, exaggeration, they made their business on one chart. It was called the experience curve. They were describing and quantifying operating performance improvement in industry after industry. They started with semiconductors, they went out to everything from Japanese beer to toilet paper, and they found the experience curve was a very accurate descriptor of how performance improved in a market or industry over time. Very accurate, but the problem was it was a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you accumulated in a market or industry, the longer and harder you had to work to get that next increment of performance improvement. Our belief is the big shift, for those who make that transition, that shift, opens up the possibility for the first time of a business world that is driven by increasing returns, where the more who participate and the more experience that's gathered, the more value that gets created for everyone. That's a very different and very exciting business world, and I'm looking forward to being part of it. Thank you very much.